When you think of versions of Windows, Windows 98 is probably one that you may think about quite a bit. And for good reason, because it is quite iconic, and it is also one of the better versions of old Windows. Alongside Windows 2000, but that's for another day. Not problematic like its successor, and not as buggy as its predecessor, Windows 98 is considered by many to be one of the most optimal versions of Windows for retro gaming, at least retro gaming from the 90s, and is still used by some people to this day. So I want to answer the questions of what can you still do with Windows 98 in 2026, and is it very usable? So let's get started with the annual series. So for some background, Windows 95 was released in 1995, and it was the first version of what is considered Windows 9X. It was also quite buggy. If you ran it on a system that wasn't powerful enough, you'd end up with stuff like this, as seen by this emulated Compact Desk Pro 386, and there were other issues, the only other one I'm going to highlight being that if ran on a CPU too fast, it would refuse to boot at all unless you patched the thing. So Microsoft took this into account with developing the next major version of Windows for home users, codenamed Nashville. However, Nashville, also known internally at the time as Windows 96, would never see the light of day because it was cancelled in, I think, also 1996 and split into two new projects. Microsoft codenamed Detroit, which became Windows 95 OSR2, and Memphis, which became Windows 98. Around this time, Microsoft is also suffering from their own success to a degree, because such success may or may not have been forced upon the industry. In 1998, Microsoft got taken to court by the US federal government, who cited that they were violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. To put it briefly, this is the law that basically states that you can't own a monopoly, and it's been used to break up many companies in US history. But apparently Microsoft was violating this because they were bundling Internet Explorer with Windows 95, which undermined competitors, primarily Netscape and Opera, and thus, yeah. Now that's a different story for another day, but this definitely did not help Microsoft's image in the weeks building up to Windows 98's release. But Windows 98 was released to the general public on the 25th of June, 1998, and people's thoughts of this version of Windows can be seen in the latest, at the time, episode of the Computer Chronicles, which was basically a Windows 98 special, barring the fact that it covered Linux, briefly. There was a segment on new features, which highlights the fact that Windows 98 was the first version of Windows, at least for home users, that had support for multiple monitors, a feature that I, and probably many others, take for granted today. Another segment featured an interview in which the interviewee stated that Windows 98 was worth the money, and that it was a bit more than just an upgrade to Windows 95. However, Windows 98 would not fix all of Windows 95's prominent issues. But to address bugs that were not yet fixed in Windows 98, Microsoft released a second version of Windows 98 in 1999, rightfully called Windows 98 Second Edition. This is the version of Windows 98 that we're going to be looking at primarily because it's a lot cleaner, but Windows 98 was supposed to be superseded by Windows Me in terms of being a home OS, something that Windows Me famously did not do, but Windows XP did, thus bringing an end to the Windows 9X line, and Windows 98 alongside Millennium Edition were both discontinued in July of 2006. So anyway, let's actually use this OS now. If you're new to this channel, then you probably don't know what computer I'm using, but if you're not new to this channel and have seen the Windows 98 and 2024 and 2025 videos, then you probably already know which computer I'm going to be using. The Dell Dimension 2100, primarily because it's just that good of a computer for me. So yeah, to go over the specs, this thing has a socket 370 Intel Celeron at 1.1 GHz, around 256 megabytes of RAM, although I was planning on upgrading that to 512 megabytes, and a 40 gigabyte SMASNUG hard drive. This thing also has integrated graphics, so when we get to the gaming stuff, it's not guaranteed to be perfect. But this was an early Windows XP system that I opted to just shove Windows 98 on as soon as I bought it, or as soon as it arrived after I bought it, because I needed a good Windows 98 system and this fit the bill well. So anyway, let's get to starting this version of Windows up. Notable programs that were either bundled with Windows 98 or were popular at the time include WordPad, MS Paint, the built-in solitaire game, Adobe Photoshop 5, and Microsoft Office 97 featuring everyone's favorite paperclip. Okay, to be honest, that running gag is kind of aged like milk, but I digress. I don't have much time to address it when my footage is like this long. And Winamp, which I'm using to test the audio playback from last week's video. However, these are only period correct computer programs. In terms of more modern programs, what are the best options you can install? For this, I looked at a list from the blog known as Operating Systems Revival. It's not a full 100% list, but it's fairly good nonetheless. And I will say this, there are two programs that I know for certain the latest versions of them will work on Windows 98. However, there's caveats to both of them. The first of these is the disk tools program Image Burn. It works basically flawless. I burned a disk and it showed up on my PC, my main PC, just fine. However, you should be careful when looking for the installer for this program because if you're not, some of the installers have adware on them. I did a virus total scan of mine to make sure that it wasn't infected with adware, and it wasn't, and also it was interestingly distributed by Microsoft. The second program is Clam Antivirus, a free and open source antivirus that is based off of the Clam AV scanner engine. And because of that, it is presumably still getting definitions to this day, even though the program has not been updated or even gone a commit on its GitHub repository since 2021. The problem is that Clamwin can take a very long time to scan on older systems, and so you won't likely be able to use the computer for the day. Or at least half of the day. I don't know. In terms of the last versions of programs that will work on Windows 98, well, Adobe and Microsoft and probably a bunch of other big name software developers dropped support for Windows 98 in the early 2000s or so. Other developers did not, such as free and open source developers and other people. WinRAR didn't drop support for Windows 98 until 2010 with version 3.93, while last version of Audacity to work on Windows 98, if you need an audio editor, is version 2.0.0 from around 2012, and I'd recommend that you use the ANSI version because I haven't tested the other version. OpenOffice.org 2.4, another program I've made a video on, and Netscape Navigator 9. In fact, for some odd reason, Netscape Navigator 9 and Netscape Navigator 3.04 seem to be able to coexist on this machine. However, this doesn't take into account dependencies, such as Java for OpenOffice.org's database stuff. However, Sun also was the developer of Java at the time, so yeah. But arguably, the thing that you'd most likely be using Windows 98 for would be gaming. So what kinds of games will work on Windows 98? So to start off, Railroad Tycoon 2. I will say that at first, I was a bit confused as to what I was supposed to do, but I jumped ahead of the tutorial. And I can safely say that I think I liked the decision of getting an extra $50,000 in the game. But I realized I was supposed to hook up a train and railroad to Washington, D.C. It took me a time to realize it wasn't very viable to build a line directly to Washington, and that's when I cracked the puzzle, and that I'm supposed to build some lines and stations in the neighboring towns of Baltimore. And to put it simply, I was quite satisfied once I was able to start making some money, and I think I'll actually play more of this game at a later date on my own time. And now back to the typical roster of SteelsOfLiquid gaming stuff, starting with Age of Empires. So the basic first level thing here is you've got to go hunt for animals and stuff, and this was quite simple at first. You basically just have to build a population of 7. The interesting thing is that one of my men got attacked by an alligator, something I didn't know was possible, and somehow my first in-game war ended with defeating the alligator. I honestly just find this interesting because I've never experienced this before, despite the fact I've shown this game like half a dozen bajillion times. Next game is going to be Need for Speed 2SE. This game was designed for Windows 95, but it works on 98, so I tried racing in the Outback with a Ford GT90. It was a bit chaotic. Wanting to try a different thing, I opted for another car and tried another track. Next, we're going to be looking at Microsoft Windows 98, which is a parody of Microsoft from this time. It's basically like a bunch of mini games. You have one called Pinball. It's basically pinball, but with Bill Gates. There's the Roll Ahead, which is basically a board game thing, parodying on Bill Gates' book, where it's basically a head-to-head between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And then win Bill Gates money with your host host Steve Jobs. It's basically like a TV game show thing on your computer. There's a bunch of other things in this, but not enough time to look at it. And last, but certainly not least, Half-Life. This was basically a game that was brand new or so when Windows 98 released, or vice versa. And to put it simply, I needed to adjust the monitor multiple times in order to get the resolution correct. And also, looking back at the footage, it's clearly something my camera doesn't like. Now, it's hard to see because my camera has the attention span of a piece of cheese, I guess. But I clearly struggled with this tutorial, maybe because I'm using a PS2 mouse with a ball in it, and also the keyboard, but I can definitely say it was quite tense. Yeah, that's gonna do it for gaming. Overall, to answer my question, on its own, without internet, is honestly fairly usable if you're okay with outdated software. If you want modern programs, then it is not ideal at all, and with internet, there's not really a modern web browser, and there's also probably many security vulnerabilities in Windows 98, but there's stuff like FrogFind that allow you to use old web browsers, but on its own, Windows 98's usability in 2026 depends on if you need the internet or not. If you need the internet, don't use it. If you need gaming or you don't mind old programs, then it's perfectly usable. So, would you agree? Do you still use Windows 98? I'm honestly curious, do you have an old Windows 98 computer? Is there something I could do to improve my content? If you have anything to say, feel free to let me know down below in the comments, and feel free to give this video a like. But that's gonna be it for this week, so thanks for watching and have a nice day.